So we need to talk about Canon. If you've been following the news at all, last week Canon announced two new full-frame mirrorless cameras, their brand new flagship EOS R1 and the successor to their very popular EOS R5, the new EOS R5 Mark II. Now, as someone who shot on Canon for a number of years, from the 5D Mark IV and 6D Mark II to the camera that really kind of kicked off my career, which was the 1DX Mark II, and then moving into the mirrorless world with the R6 and the R5, and now the main camera that I use for all of my wedding work, which is the R3, I was really interested to see what these cameras were going to offer, what the upgrades they were going to have from previous cameras. And so what I want to do in this video is just kind of walk through the release, some of the specs that each of these cameras have to offer, and just share some of my thoughts on whether or not these cameras are worth the upgrade, what I kind of think about these cameras in general, and provide some personal thoughts on what I think you should do if you're looking to upgrade your Canon camera system or get into the camera ecosystem in general. So the first camera I want to talk about is the new Canon flagship camera, the EOS R1. Now, as someone who shot with the not flagship camera, the EOS R3 for a number of years, I was really interested to see what the R1's release was going to be all about. When the R3 came out, Canon was very specific. This is not our flagship camera. This is not equivalent to our one line of cameras. That's still coming. There's still a flagship coming. It's going to be amazing. But honestly, I was really impressed with the R3, and I still am. The camera's phenomenal in most every category, but Canon insisted this is not our flagship. There's still a flagship to come, and now that flagship has been released, and it's the EOS R1. So looking at the R1, it comes in with a brand new 24.2 megapixel sensor. This is a backside illuminated stacked sensor, very similar to the one that was in the R3. This is a new sensor, so they've done a full new sensor development for the R1, and that's definitely going to show in certain categories like autofocus and some of the AI stuff that they can do, and some of the tracking and some of the, kind of sensor shift technology that allows you to upscale images in the camera. So it's definitely a new sensor. There's new technology in the camera, but it's still a 24 megapixel sensor, even though the R1 has a 24.2 and the R3 had a 24.1. Negligible difference in terms of actual resolution. Do I think the sensor is going to be better? Yes, it's definitely, it's a new sensor. There's new technology. I think that definitely will showcase in the imagery and in the performance on the R1 versus the R3. But again, kind of looking at things at face value, it's not a huge upgrade there. That being said, the new sensor technology has given rise to a fully upgraded autofocus system, which is kind of interesting to think about, because looking at the R3, I've said many times, I think the R3's autofocus system is the best autofocus system I've ever used in the camera, and the R1 is touting that it's substantially better than the R3. You have full autofocus readout across the entire sensor. You have cross-type sensors for more accurate and responsive focusing. And you have some improvements in what the camera can actually track with this new action priority mode, where it can specifically recognize soccer, basketball, volleyball, and it can analyze ball, joint, torso, action, and head information for tracking. It can recognize specific subjects and use this information in conjunction with recognized movements to determine where to focus in the scene while the action's unfolding. I've seen some video examples of this, and it looks really powerful. This new sensor and the new autofocus technology in the R1 has allowed the camera to literally track subjects through a moving sports scene and kind of predict where the action's going to go, so that even before you move the camera can automatically autofocus on a specific subject, knowing that the action is going to move across the sensor over to here, which is just mind-blowing to think about how this actually works in practical sports shooting. So there's definitely been a noticeable autofocus upgrade from the R3 to the R1. They've also upgraded the eye control autofocus, which is kind of interesting. It's something I never really utilized fully on the R3. It was really powerful, but it just felt a little bit gimmicky, a little bit glitchy. It wasn't fully predictable, and I couldn't fully trust that it was going to work every single time. And so I really like that they've improved this and upgraded this. I will say one of the reasons I didn't like using eye control is because, I don't know if you're anything like me, but when I'm composing a shot, especially when I'm composing shots, when I'm shooting action in sports, I like to look around the viewfinder and see what else is happening in the frame, but still be tracking the initial subject that I told the camera to start tracking. But I don't want the camera to just switch focus. I'm just kind of looking around using my peripheral vision in the sensor to see what else is happening to help me compose the shot, move the camera around and all that. And that's where I kind of found eye control a little bit gimmicky. Personally, I like to just focus on one specific subject and track that subject, and not have me looking around in the sensor or looking around kind of outside the camera determine where the autofocus is going to happen. So for me, I personally didn't really love using eye control, but I like that Canon is upgrading that and making that even better. And it definitely has a place in very specific settings. One thing I really love that they've upgraded is the EVF. This has been a huge upgrade over the R3. which I believe had like a 5 million dot EVF, and now this is like 9.4. So a huge upgrade there. The R3's viewfinder was already one of the best I'd used, and so I love the fact that they're upgrading that and making that even better. And as would be expected of a Canon top-end flagship camera, they have really like doubled down on the weather sealing and the body design and the ruggedness of this camera, making the R1 a little bit more similar to like maybe the body design of the 1DX Mark II and 1DX Mark III, and some little random things on it that like double latches for like the card slots and all that I really liked on my 1DX and didn't have on my R3. So really love that they've added a couple of things there on the R1. They've also switched both camera slots over to dual CF Express Type B cards. And one of the things I really love is they finally listened to all of us video shooters and added a full-size HDMI port, which is huge, huge, huge. I wish I had that on my R3. That just makes things so much better when you're shooting video. And then one other thing I really do want to mention, and this is one of the things I talked about in a previous video about what I would love to see in future Canon cameras, and that was the addition of C-Log 2 and some other higher end professional mirrorless cameras. And thankfully, Canon listened. I don't know if they watched my video, I'm guessing they didn't, but C-Log 2 is now integrated into the R1, which is just fantastic for syncing that up if you're shooting with Canon cinema cameras, or even just in general want to have the best, flattest, most dynamic log profile that Canon has to offer, which is C-Log 2. I really love that they've added this into the R1. It's something I wish my R3 had. I really don't prefer to work in C-Log 3 if I can help it. They've also added false color to the display on the back so you can have false color monitoring. And they've also added a physical tally lamp to the front of the camera, which is just super helpful when you're in front of the camera and you want to make sure the camera's recording. And so those little upgrades are definitely welcome. So there's definitely been some substantial upgrades on this camera from a camera like the R3, the newly designed sensor, upgraded autofocus system, addition of C-Log 2, a tally light, full HDMI ports. But overall, this camera definitely feels like an R3 Mark II with just a little bit different body design versus like a brand new R1 flagship camera. And I think that's why I'm a little bit underwhelmed with the R1 release. For so many years, Canon kind of put down the R3 saying, no, our flagship is coming, our flagship is coming. And I had really, really huge expectations for what the R1 could be. And while the R1 is definitely not an unimpressive camera, it's a really fantastic camera, and I think it's going to serve a lot of photographers and filmmakers very, very well. I think it's been a little bit overshadowed by the fact that the R3 was just truly that good, and the R1 feels like just a little bit of an upgrade. That being said, if you are in the market for a camera like this camera is going to be phenomenal. I think it's going to have amazing autofocus. People are going to be very, very impressed with the overall performance of the camera. Having C-Log 2, having an HDMI port, having that tally lamp, having false color, that's going to be super helpful for video shooters. And even though they haven't upgraded the resolution or anything of the camera, I think people are still going to be genuinely happy with this camera. That being said, if you are in the market to change cameras, we have to talk about the R5 Mark II first. As impressive as the R1 is, when you start looking at the price tag, the features that are offered, and then you start comparing that to the R3, and especially this new R5 Mark II, the R1 becomes even less impressive. Now, the R5 was already a phenomenal camera. It offered some really great performance, and even though it wasn't the camera for me, just because the speed of that camera couldn't keep up with what I needed, and that's why I needed the R3, the R5 Mark II feels like, honestly, everything I've wanted in a Canon camera. It has a 45 megapixel full frame sensor. This is also a backside illuminated sensor, so it's an even better sensor than was in the original R5. It allows for 8K 60 frames per second raw footage to be filmed, as well as 4K 60 SRAW and 4K 120 10-bit, which is really impressive for a hybrid camera like the R5. They've upgraded the shooting speed, so now this camera can shoot at 12 frames per second in raw images on the mechanical shutter, which is identical to the R3, or 30 frames per second with the electronic shutter, again, identical to the R3. They've also added a lot of the autofocus features in the R1 to the R5 Mark II. Now, from what I'm reading, I don't think the R5 Mark II's autofocus system is going to be quite as good as the R1, but it looks like the R5 Mark II's autofocus is going to be really, really robust. They've added the eye control feature from the R3, but the upgraded version that's in the R1. The autofocus system includes all the same head, eye, upper body, joint structure tracking that's in the R1, as well as the action priority settings for kind of the AI determination of where the focus is going to go, also similar to the R1. The R5 Mark II also includes the same electronic viewfinder found in the R3, which was, like I said, one of the most impressive EVFs I've ever used. It's not going to compare to the R1's even more upgraded EVF, but it's still a very, very impressive EVF and one that I've been very, very happy with. It has the same noise reduction and in-camera upscaling found on the R1, and all the same video features that the R1 has, like C-Log 2, a full-size HDMI port, tally lights, false color, and waveform, but the R5 can record all the way up to 8K 60, while the R1 can only record up to 6K 60. They've also redesigned the camera body to allow for more ventilation, which will hopefully eliminate some of the overheating issues of the original R5, and they've introduced not one or two, but 3 new battery grips, including one that has a cooling fan built into the battery grip, which allows for even more ventilation of the camera by utilizing the fan in the body grip. So overall, looking at these two cameras, I'm way more impressed with the R5 Mark II than I am the R1. And while I mentioned earlier that the R1 kind of feels like an R3 Mark II, honestly, so does the R5 Mark II. The R5 Mark II is scary similar to the R3 in terms of specs and performance, while still offering some really nice upgrades like a full-size HDMI port, tally lights, the ability to shoot in 8K, C-Log 2, false color, waveform. Honestly, if we look at it, the R5 Mark II kind of feels like a hybrid between the R3, the R5, and the R5C, combining the best of Canon's platforms into one camera that you can actually get for $2,000 less than their flagship R1. So unless you need those couple additional features that are found in the R1, I feel like the R5 Mark II kind of steals the spotlight here. So overall, here's my thoughts on this whole release. Both of these cameras are really, really solid. Now, do they compare and contrast with other brands and other camera manufacturers? Not really, especially the R1 really feels like it falls short from a lot of stuff from Sony and Nikon. When you start comparing the R1 with like the A1 and the A9 III, there's just a lot better options for a lot less cost than the R1. But that doesn't mean the R1's a bad camera. It's still a phenomenal camera. It still has some really fantastic technology built into it. And I think people are really going to love it, especially for sports and action shooting. But my emphasis here really has to be on the R5 Mark II, because I feel like this is going to be one of those cameras where this camera is just going to take over the Canon market. For the longest time, photographers and filmmakers have been begging Canon to come out with a camera that could perform really well on the stills side with a high resolution camera and have some great video features, borrowing some specific things from the cinema line, like a full-size HDMI port, C-Log 2, some false color and waveform options, and all of that stuff is included in the R5 Mark II. And so while the R1 is kind of an underwhelming release, even though it's a really powerful camera that has some great features, I feel like the R5 Mark II is going to be the camera that all Canon users gravitate towards. Even myself, even though a lot of my work is shot on Sony nowadays, I still shoot a portion of my work on my R3, and I'm definitely thinking about selling the R3 to pick up an R5 Mark II, because I'd have very similar, if not the same features in my R3, but I'd also have the ability to shoot up to 8K. I'd have a 45 megapixel stills camera. I'd have some new autofocus features. I'd have the ability to shoot C-Log 2. I'd gain a full-size HDMI port and some tally lights, waveform, false color, a lot of those options that I would genuinely use on a day-to-day basis. Now, I know I have a lot of R3 users on this channel, and if you're shooting on the R3 currently and you're looking at the Canon R1, if you have the budget and you really want that like integrated vertical grip style pro body camera like the 1DX series, go for the R1. I don't think it's going to be a camera that disappoints you. However, if you want to save $2,000 and you want some additional features, I would recommend the R5 Mark II. I keep saying this, but I genuinely think the R5 Mark II for Canon users specifically is going to become like the new holy grail camera for the next couple of years until something else comes out. So anyway, those are my thoughts on the new EOS R1 and EOS R5 Mark II. If you have any thoughts on these cameras or if you've used them, let me know down in the comments. Let me know if you're going to be upgrading, cross-grading, what your thoughts are on these cameras, and I would be happy to have a discussion with you about that. And as a side note, I was having a conversation with another photographer the other day about cameras. We were just kind of talking about the cameras that exist in the market right now. And I really think you can't go wrong with almost any camera manufacturer that's out there. I feel like in the last 5 years, all of the camera manufacturers have really stepped up their game, and you have some really impressive cameras across the board. And so whether or not you love the R1 or the R5 Mark II, I think is kind of irrelevant. These are great cameras that are absolutely going to get the job done, and I don't really want to argue about specs and all that. But I do think the R5 Mark II is going to be a really solid performer in the Canon lineup. I'll definitely want to rent one and try it out once it comes out, but that video will be coming later. All right, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.